I remember having an aha moment during an interview about one of these hot button issues. And I remember realizing this is not the issue I learned about in poli-sci. This is a man. This is a human. This is a human being with a past and with traumas and with things that he's working out. It's not an issue. It's not just an issue, it's someone's life. And that's what listening to learn and listening with empathy will bring you. Welcome to Happiness in Progress. I'm your host, Danielle Craig. I am an Emmy Award-winning journalist, a mom, a wife, and just like you, I'm a human being. This podcast is all about finding more joy in the everyday, adding perspective to your life, along with grace, wholeness, and really just finding the best version of you. This podcast is brought to you by the Mail Tribune. The Mail Tribune has several podcasts. You can find them at mailtribune.com. I'm so excited for today's episode. I always start with that, don't I? It's because I'm always excited about the episode. I am talking about listening. It is such an important skill to have. I actually planned this episode weeks ago when no one was listening to each other about coronavirus. You know, it's true. We were all yelling out our opinions with our ears closed, just yelling at each other. And now I think this conversation, this episode, is more important than even when I planned it. Because now we're having a really hard time listening to one another as we talk about the violence against Black Americans. And we are fighting a lot online and in person. And I really think that listening is so key and needs to be added to the conversations. So that's why I really, especially today, weeks ago I thought this was important. It's even more important today. And you know what? It's going to be important every single day for the rest of your life. This is a skill that everyone needs to start working on. So obviously I love to talk. I have a podcast, for crying out loud. Of course I love to talk. I used to joke that my name Danielle was Danielle for the yell part because I love to talk loudly. I love it. It's true. But in journalism, I had to learn the skill listening. When I was an early journalist, I was still in college, but I got my first reporting job. I would write down all of my questions I wanted to ask. And I would go to my interview, and I would sit in front of my interviewee. I'd get my questions out. I remember I would stare at my list. Okay, memorize the list of questions. I got it. And then I would look at my interviewee, and I would just start asking the questions. I remember vividly sitting in the office of someone I was interviewing. He was here, I was here. I'm holding the mic, and then I can see like outside the window. I remember vividly like daydreaming as this man was explaining the answer to the question I just asked. Again, early reporting days, like first probably 3-6 months. And it occurred to me as this was going on that I needed to pay attention to what he was saying. And I did this for a while where I would just memorize the questions and I would remember, okay, I got to ask this question next. Okay, is he done talking yet? Okay, I got to ask this question now. And I wasn't listening to the questions or the answers. And the problem with not listening to the answers is I would get back to the studio or the station and I would be going through and I'd be like, why didn't I ask him this? Of course, it occurred to me I didn't ask him that because I wasn't listening. You can't ask follow-up questions if you're not listening to begin with. Around that time, as I realized I wasn't asking the questions that needed to be asked based on the answers I was getting, I stopped writing questions before interviews. I would go to interviews basically knowing what I wanted to talk about, but not writing specific word-for-word questions down. Instead, I would just talk to the person. I would just have a conversation. And this changed my interviews. It changed the information I came back with to the station. I was a lot more prepared. I understood the person's story a lot more. And that is what I call listening to learn. Because if I'm a reporter and I have to turn a story in less than 8 hours and I am going from interviewing to writing to editing, I really should know, I should understand fully their story. So that is, again, what I call listening to learn. And I also think that part of that is listening with empathy. And as I say listening with empathy, I don't want you to confuse that with not asking hard questions. I've talked about being a skeptic on this podcast before. You know I'm a skeptic. You know I ask hard questions. So hard questions are important because it it forces both you and the interviewee to think. And I think that's really important when you're with a friend that you don't agree with. If you ask a hard question, not in an accusatory tone. In fact, as a reporter, I never would be like, oh, well, I think this about that, because reporters, we're not supposed to have opinions. That is the way that I was taught in school, not to have an opinion. So I wouldn't be sharing an opinion with someone I was talking to. Instead, I would say something like, what do you say to people who, and then I would give them the exact opposite of what they were saying. This is really enlightening as a journalist and as a human being, because you give the person the opportunity to take their platform, to step up on their soapbox, to really tell you the ins and outs of their theory. Asking a hard question doesn't mean you don't want to learn more. Asking a hard question means you're trying to learn. And I think some of those hard conversations need to happen right now. Some of those uncomfortable conversations need to happen right now. When it comes to listening with empathy, one of the things that I did early on in my career was decide I would not make a decision about a person before I got to the interview. So I would go to a lot of places that were uncomfortable. I would talk about subjects that were sometimes uncomfortable, and I had decided that I was not going to place judgment on these people. It wasn't my responsibility to do that. My only responsibility was to represent two sides, and that is what I stuck to. And by doing that, I was really able to give people a fresh slate. They were able to come to me, stand in front of my camera with a fresh slate. This makes me think of teachers. I don't know if you have ever had a kid or been the kid that was labeled the bad kid or the noisy kid or the disruptive kid or the class clown. What happens is, I think you've probably seen this, a first grade teacher can experience this. They can label the kid. They can tell the second grade teacher. The second grade teacher then has two options. Are they going to go with the label and treat the kid differently right out the gate? Or are they going to give that student a fresh slate, a second chance to prove himself or herself? Obviously, when the student gets a fresh slate, they have a chance to turn things around. They don't really get a chance if we've just decided, okay, they're the bad kid, and we're going to let them be the bad kid all the way through their elementary school experience. So with human beings in general, I want to do another episode about not judging each other. But one of the important things is to walk into a conversation with a fresh set of eyes. Maybe you've had a similar conversation that went awry. Maybe you've read all the articles. Maybe you feel this way about this subject and you're not ready for having this with a human being again. So you're already on the defensive. But when you come in just to learn, it's as easy as that, just to learn. And that fresh slate is something I tried to give every single one of the interviewees that would walk in front of my camera. That's one of the really cool things about being a reporter, is that within the same day, within the same 8-hour shift, you can go from talking to someone on the far left of an issue and then go talk to someone else on the far right of the exact same issue. The reason this is so powerful is because we get to see issues not as just an issue. We get to see beyond the issue. We get to see the human being on the other side. We can talk to a woman who says abortion saved her life and turn around and talk to someone who says abortion ruined their life. We can talk to someone who believes strongly in gun restrictions and to ban guns. And we can see with empathy and, maybe even love how their path in life got them to that conclusion. We can also turn around and see someone who believes fully with their heart that they should have the right to bear arms. And we can, again, with that empathy, even with that love sometimes, we can see how their path in life got them to that conclusion. We see humans, not as hot button issues, but humans with complex emotions, traumas, things they're dealing with, all kinds of stuff going on in their life and in their brain and in their past. I remember having an aha moment during an interview about one of these hot button issues. And I remember realizing, this is not the issue I learned about in poli-sci. This is a man. This is a human. This is a human being with a past and with traumas and with things that he's working out. It's not an issue. It's not just an issue, it's someone's life. And that's what listening to learn and listening with empathy will bring you. It will bring you that behind the scenes look at an issue. that there are human beings with real lives and real emotions that matter. And this is a hard one to say because this is a hard one to listen to on both sides of the issue. On both sides of the issue, there are humans who are doing the best they can. And that's a hard thing to hear too, especially when you're really, really angry, upset, or sad about whatever the issue is. You know, when I planned this episode a month ago, the issues I was talking about were things like your livelihood and not being able to open up your business. And now I'm talking about things like being treated differently by the color of your skin. Obviously, those two things are different, but those two things are not easy for us to deal with as human beings, and they're uncomfortable things to talk about, and they're things that we need to confront together and that we need to talk about together through listening. So how do we bring this into our own lives? It's way easier to say, okay, I'm going to listen, than it is to actually listen, especially when you do not see eye to eye. And I know that's hard. And really, the only reason that I'm good at it now is because I had a decade and a half of practicing the art of listening because I had to listen, because I had a camera and a microphone and a job to do. So it was way easier to do that when it was my job. So I know this isn't easy. But number one is to be okay with not being right. Try to get into the conversation just to listen and not to debate. You're not trying to win a debate. You're just listening. What if you did that? Number two, stop feeling like you have to follow up with your opinion. You can just follow up with another question. And this is a really good time to stop saying, yeah, but. Because that's not the kind of conversation you're trying to have. Remember, you are trying to listen. You're not trying to yeah, but someone. Let them say their whole thing. Hear the hurt, hear the pain, hear how this is impacting their heart and their soul and their life. Another part of being a good listener is to listen without judgment. I know. I know it's basically impossible. I know, I'm sorry I'm asking this of you, but this is the thing that's going to make the difference for you. Listening without judgment means you're listening to learn. But it's a practice. And you know what? If you're not perfect at it, baby steps. Even if you're never perfect at listening without judgment and withholding that judgment as you listen to something that you think is crazy, that you can't even understand, if you're listening to learn and listening to know what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes, it's an important step. So at least practice. Several years ago, there was a reporter who got a lot of attention for walking into a jailhouse interview. And I can't remember the exact specifics. I wasn't able to find the old articles. They're buried in the web. But she went into this, actually, I want you to imagine. Okay, just imagine this before we get into the actual story. Imagine you go into a jailhouse interview and you're going to interview a murder suspect. Imagine this murder suspect puts out his hand to shake your hand. What do you do? Think about it for a second. What do you do? Do you shake his hand? Do you refuse to shake his hand? Do you know what the reporter did? The reporter stuck out her hand and shook his hand. This got a ton of attention in the journalism world. And what her response was when people said, why in the world would you shake someone's hand who was suspected of murder? And her answer was something along the lines of, who am I to judge? Like, I'm a reporter. He's not been convicted. It wasn't that I went and I shook the hand of a convicted murderer. It's that I was sitting down with someone who was going to, tell his case, whether that was I'm not guilty or whatever it was. She felt she didn't have a place to judge whether he was guilty or not. He was a suspect, and she shook his hand as she would any other interview she had. So this was really interesting for me, and honestly, I'm not sure I'm there on shaking a murder suspect's hand. And it's really hard to even imagine if you would do that, especially if you're thinking about a specific murder suspect. But what if we're not talking about a murder suspect? What if we're talking about like your grandma or your cousin or your friend or someone you just follow on social media? What if we're just talking about just having a conversation and not involving something like a murder suspect? What if we're just talking about just someone who you don't agree with? Maybe you can start that conversation with a handshake. Maybe it's even a mental handshake if you're not close, social distancing still going on. Maybe you just start with listening, no judgment. Part of this conversation and having an honest conversation is that when you are doing the talking, that you're being authentic, that you're being real and you're being honest, even if it hurts, even if it's painful. Again, when I planned this episode about coronavirus, I had noticed two of my Facebook friends talking to each other in my feed. And they were arguing, and one of them, was like, oh, we have to open up businesses. And the other one was like, oh, we have to save the elderly. And this conversation was going back and forth. And what was interesting for me is that I know both of them personally, and they were only speaking on the hot button issues. They were only saying the things we've seen all over the paper, the things we've seen all over social media. They weren't saying the heart behind their opinions. One of the people who said we need to open up businesses is someone who had just opened up a brand new business, who had poured everything into this brand new business and had it open for, I think, just a few weeks before they had to close. The other person is someone who works really, really closely with all kinds of people every single day and has a huge love for the human beings. And I wonder if they would have just said that, if that would have added perspective to the conversation instead of just the headlines, Oh, you don't care about the elderly because you're not wearing a mask. Oh, you don't care about small businesses because you think we should be closed forever. Instead of just saying those hot button issue headlines, if they just said, hey, look, I'm really struggling because I took out a loan for more than $1 million and I got to pay it back, but nobody can come to my business. I'm not making any money and this is a scary time for me. I'm really scared. Or I have these close friends and I know that their grandparents are already lonely. They're lonely on a daily basis even before coronavirus, and now I'm really worried about them. What if we just came together with our hearts instead of our headlines? How big of a difference would that make for our conversations? Of course, that was over coronavirus, and now we're in a place where a lot of people are demanding justice for George Floyd, as they should. And I wonder if the conversations looked a little bit more like, hey, friend, I have been dealing with this kind of racism my entire life. And hey, it makes me feel uncomfortable when you call me racist just because I'm white. What if those two conversations came together like that, involving the heart and involving the soul instead of the headlines? I really believe if we lead with our authentic selves, with our hearts and our souls, and the fact that we're a human being talking to another human being, we'll be able to accomplish a lot more. We'll be able to reach common ground and fight for one another because we'll understand the path another person's walked. And this isn't only for now. This isn't only right now while our country is divided over Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. This is relevant every day of our lives. This was relevant when we were dealing with coronavirus and no one could get on the same page of whether to wear a mask or not. This was before then when we were talking about the president, and before then when we were talking about healthcare. I mean, we could probably go so far back. And I know social media amplifies this. Social media is not made for listening. Social media is made for declarations. You go onto social media, you type in your status update, your declaration of whatever it is you believe is true, and it goes out. And a lot of us have curated feeds made up of people who agree with us exactly. So we just get a lot of likes and loves, a lot of cares now. And we don't have to face anything uncomfortable. We don't have to challenge ourselves with thoughts that don't agree with us or don't line up with ours. It's not good to never be challenged because you never grow. And sometimes you're going to listen to someone and you're not going to agree. And that's okay. But just by listening, you're walking in their shoes. You're at least trying to walk in their shoes. You're trying to understand their perspective. And that's the first step. The first step is to try to see what life looks like through a different lens. And as you do that, you're going to grow. And maybe that means you'll say, you know what, I understand where they're coming from. I think I can fight for that. I think I can be there for them. So I want to end this episode with a challenge to you. And this is my challenge all of the time, not just right now. This is my challenge yesterday, tomorrow, all of the days. My challenge is for you to talk to someone you don't agree with. I want you to find the person you disagree with the most and just listen. Not debate, just listen. Not try to prove you're right, just listen. I have a friend, an old colleague, who I basically disagree with her on all things. Basically everything, but she is one of my favorite people in the world because I see her as a human. I don't see her as a person who disagrees on every single issue with me. And when I talk to her, I get to listen and I get to learn and I get to listen how her life experience and her grandparents and her parents' life experiences impacted the way that she thinks and why she thinks certain things are important. And that has made me grow as a human being. And very little things I've sided with her on from these conversations. But again, the growth is there and the listening is there and the perspective and the fact that I can stand beside her and support her in her calling, even if it's a little bit different than what I would be fighting for. So again, back to the challenge. I just want to challenge you to, feel a little uncomfortable. Listen to someone you don't agree with. Talk to someone you don't agree with. And if you don't have that friend to actually talk to, go read an article that you feel uncomfortable reading, that's someone else's perspective, that makes you have to grow, makes you have to ask yourself hard questions, makes you challenge your belief system a little bit. That's a good thing, and that's really good for you to do. Every single day of the year, every single issue. Honestly, there's not an issue that I don't think you should be doing this on. I had the privilege of being a reporter for years, sitting in living rooms and looking in people's eyes and being able to see that we're all just human. We're all just human. The majority of us are trying our best with the tools we have, with the knowledge we have from the paths we've walked. All we have to do is listen to be able to see what another person is going through. With that, I want to end this conversation, this podcast episode, with my favorite quote. It's a good one. It's not my favorite quote, but it is one of my favorites. And it is, if you're the one listening, you're going to know twice as much as the other guy. And with that, I want to thank you for being here on Happiness in Progress.